Welcome everybody to our booth and our second panel of the day. My name is Katie Weeks. I'm the Chief Editor of Sustainability for Hanley Wood, and I'm joined by two of my great colleagues today. On my left, I have Katie Gerfen, who's the Executive Editor of Residential Architect and Architect magazines. And to my right, I have Claire Conroy, who is Editorial Content Director of Executive Programs for Hanley Wood and Consulting Editor for Residential Architect. And today, we are going to talk about resilient design, which is a huge buzzword right now in the green realm. And I think it's a fascinating topic because there's so many different things that go into play in resilient design, which is a part of sustainability as well. So Katie and Claire, I wanted to start off by throwing it out there. When I say the term resilient or resilient design, from your perspective, what's the first thing that comes to mind? I'll start with Katie.
You know, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is still is disaster relief. Still at this point, you know, if sort of prodded to four-word association about resiliency, I think that's an area where we talk about it a lot. I think it gets a lot of attention, and I think it's kind of interesting to see now how that conversation is starting to broaden beyond disaster relief. So that's something it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, I immediately think of preppers, you know, in their basement with a lot of water, canned goods, and some, you know, high-powered something. But you're right. I think disaster relief, emergency shelters, these are the things that we think about when we hear resilience or resiliency. And I did look up the difference between those two this morning because I've been wondering, and they mean exactly the same thing. In this country, we tend to use resiliency. In other countries, they tend to say resilience. But I think in chasing all of these disasters, we're getting a little tired of being reactive, and I think everyone's thinking now about how can we be proactive? How can we, when we're building new, make that house as flexible, as willow tree-like as possible, so that it won't break when, you know, the big one comes. And how do we retrofit our existing housing? And then beyond that, do we rebuild where we've already had a disaster, you know, in exactly the same way as we did before, in exactly the same, you know, disaster-prone location as we built before? So these are some of the questions I think that are coming up when we talk about resilience and resiliency.
And I think I'll add one more element on there, and this may be because I'm in the green realm a lot, but I think about climate change.
Yes.
And not necessarily in terms of there are more frequent storms or more superstorms, hurricanes, things along those lines in the disaster relief sense, but also in terms of rising sea levels and longer, hotter summers that are driving people indoors, so they're spending more time indoors, and then that changes, they're exposed to different materials indoors for a longer time. So how do we design for those sort of elements as well? And I think that's the interesting thing about resilient design or resiliency, depending on what geographic region you're coming from, is that there's so many different variables that come into play. And I wanted to talk to you guys about an element. We were all at a conference that Hanley Wood held, the Reinvention Symposium, in October in San Francisco, and the focus was resilient design. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting is a lot of the speakers said resilient design is about community, which I found fascinating, that it's about an individual building, but it's also about protecting the community itself. And I thought you guys might have some thoughts on that as well, but I thought that was a really fascinating turn of this traditional sense of just thinking about a singular building.
Yeah, I think it was Eric Seizal of Architecture for Humanity, who was their resiliency director, pointed out the importance of community. And I think it's not just how do you fortify a community against possible disaster, but how do you empower that community to react in times of trouble? If you think about it, one of the most resilient things you can have is this really strong network of community support, of knowing your neighbor, of being able to ask your neighbor for help, of being able to give help to a neighbor, because, you know, with a tornado, one house may be still standing, one house may be gone in the same neighborhood. I mean, in my neighborhood, we have this crazy power grid where my immediate neighbor is on a completely different grid than we are. So my power goes out my electric cord is going to his outdoor outlet to power my refrigerator and vice versa. And that's a small way in which you can be resilient as a community. It's just you're there to take care of the other person when that other person needs it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's, at that reinvention symposium that we were all at, that you mentioned, I think it was also Byron Mouton from Tulane who pointed out that when building houses again in the lower Ninth Ward after Hurricane Katrina, that one of the best ways to actually get the community to work with the architects was to engage with the community itself. That kind of coming in and imposing ideas wasn't actually the way to get people to adopt new methodologies and new ways of thinking about how they could continue to live in the same area. And I think your point of do we rebuild in the same spot is a very good one. And it was actually here this morning that it was Bob Dixon, the mayor of Greenbuild, Kansas, at a resiliency panel this morning at Greenbuild said, of course, it's our home, number one. And number two, you might think it's in the middle of nowhere, but for us, it's the middle of everywhere. And so, these ideas of should we be looking at not rebuilding in the same places, or should we be looking at ways to build smarter in all places, be it Greensburg, Kansas, be it places in Tornado Alley, be it New York City, be it Philadelphia. How can we use the same principles and ideologies to actually make it smarter across the board?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that about, it's our home, because at the Affordable Housing Summit yesterday, there was a panel on resilient design, and one of the speakers was from New York and was talking about the Far Rockaways, which were hit very hard by Hurricane Sandy. And she had this great quote where she said, we can't just pick up the city and move it to Ohio because we have a lot of coastline. That's not an option. We're going to rebuild. And they came up with some really wonderful strategies that were quite interesting. So I think that's a really interesting element of it.
One more thing to add about the community aspect of it is I think, one of the things that a lot of people have been talking about is how important it is. You can get federal help, you can get aid, you can get help from big corporations, but it really is building and rebuilding these communities from the ground up, using the sort of Greek chorus cast of players of all of the people who actually know what it's like to live there, who know what it is like to actually be in that space, to really help inform design, be it residential, be it commercial, be it infrastructure, because they know what it is to be there. And so that building from the ground up ideology, as opposed to kind of waiting for people to come in and help. Again, Bob Dixon from this morning likened it to wanting to be an owner of your community as opposed to a renter. In your community, someone has to fix the pipes. It should probably be you.
Now, you can't just impose a design solution on a community, even if it seemed like it would really work well in the laboratory. You need to have the ownership of the community to really make it work.
And I think that touches on another point that Eric made at Reinvention about how when you need to rebuild a community itself, it's not just about one singular building. If you have a whole block that's gone, you can build that one home and come back, but they've lost that. It's not home anymore because you've lost the sense of community if you're not rebuilding the whole neighborhood.
And yet that's part of the way that New Orleans came back was just one or two neighbors committing, I am going to rebuild here, to give the other residents just that little bit of catalyst of, okay, well, if you can do it and you're coming back, I'll come back too. So it's starting that chain. It's almost like a phone chain. It's the rebuilding chain of catalyzing that resilience and that return.
And I think one of the interesting things, and we've kind of touched on it in these cities where they say, well, it's our home, we're going back, is, and Claire, we talked about this last week when we were kind of brainstorming, was, well, we have these places where we know they're not the best places to build in a longevity sense because of various circumstances. But how do we want that aspect of the beauty and the prospect, and how do we balance that with the practicality of these areas? And I think that's a design challenge these days.
Well, one of the interesting keynote speeches at Reinvention was by Bill Browning, who's with Terrapin Green, a green consultant. He has been looking into the science of the power of nature and the power of prospect and refuge to actually improve human health and human well-being. And the simple act of looking at a beautiful view is apparently healing, will lower your cortisol levels, will give you a sense of relief from stress. So I don't think we can discount the importance of that beautiful place that lifts the spirits, that provides us with that delight. We just need to make sure we have the firmness and commodity as well.
I also think it's so important to consider. I think you're right, Katie, first off, that it is a design challenge. And it's actually an exciting design challenge in a lot of ways, because it's how do you turn something that could be very fortress-like. You know, you could basically turn cities into fortresses. How do we make them stand up against everything? Be it from, you know, every home to every office building to everything. How do we make them bunkers? And turning that on its head, how do we actually still make this a beautiful, livable city that people will want to be in? Because ultimately, I think if you don't, and sort of getting back to our original point, it's about the community. If the community doesn't want to live there, if you're not creating a space that people want to inhabit, that they're going to want to stay in long enough to get those health benefits, although I think it actually was only like 30 seconds that you needed to see the outside to get some of them. But you know, then you're not going to be creating a space that's actually going to thrive again, be it pre-disaster, post-disaster, what have you. And I think, you know, the idea of bringing people back to a city after disaster and stopping flight from a city should a disaster hit can be very much helped by this idea of creating a beautiful place that can still stand up. So it's, you know, I think it is really a lot about balance, but it's been interesting to see how architects and designers and planners are responding, and landscape architects as well are really responding to that challenge by creating so many schemes that are actually making things more open while making them more secure.
Right, because maybe the answer isn't build a bunker, maybe the answer is build even more lightly so that, you know, it does break down, it does fall down, and it's easy to rebuild, and it's inexpensive to rebuild. So maybe building lightly is the answer, as long as you do have safe places for people to go in an emergency. Maybe it's about creating a community shelter. That's the bunker, that's, you know, the air raid shelter, and you've got everything else lightly built. Now, I lived in Belize as a child, and that's an area that was prone to hurricanes and lots of storm surges, and everything was just built up on stilts. Of course, it all went bye-bye in a hurricane, but then everyone would get together and build the house again, and you start all over through community.
I think that's a really interesting thing, and it makes me think of another thing Bill Browning mentioned in his keynote for reinvention, which was it's like the idea of the quick pop-ups that can happen afterwards as well. And he had mentioned it was almost like a pop-up solar and charging station that they had put in Lower Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy. And it was really fascinating because it just gave people, it was a really interesting idea of how architecture can be so beneficial afterwards, and that they set up this solar-powered little one-room shack almost, hut, kiosk, and gave people chances to just come and charge their phones because no one had electricity in the lower part of Manhattan when the power was all out. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about architecture too, that there's a lot of power in that, in the temporary, and again, it's stuff that comes and goes. It's not about being a fortress or a bunker.
It's also using design thinking and applying it across a variety of levels. It doesn't always have to be a building, it doesn't always have to be a plan, but the design thinking can be applied across so many things.
And that's what architects are so good at, is that holistic thinking, not just one piece, but connecting the dots so they're going to make an interesting, viable solution, which is a great opportunity, I think, for architects and for green designers and green consultants to put that all together.
And I think also for them to, architects and designers and the collaboration that comes from it I'm thinking of a lot of the Hurricane Sandy proposals that are coming out where you have architecture firms designing a blue way in Brooklyn that better designs of that. Or there was a landscape architect that I read the other week. They were calling it oyster texture. Did you see that? And it was about growing oysters in the bay because they will help with storm surges. And it's just very
So
creative.
biomimicry, whatever you can bring into play. And architects and designers are great at coalition building, are great at working in teams. So building that panel of different experts who can all collaborate, to invent a new solution.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to discuss in this area. We could probably go on all day, but thank you guys for joining me. Thank you everyone in the booth for joining us, and we look forward to continuing to explore the evolving topic of resiliency or resilient design, depending on your location, as we go forward.